appreciate splitting up the sessions. I think all of us are dealing with some virtual event overload, so it's nice to have it spread out rather than all at once. So thank you all for your work on that, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're doing well, or as well as can be. And I'll be talking today about design thinking, academic libraries, and the MLIS, both as sort of like the MLIS in general, but then also specifically about the MLIS at Pitt. So just a little bit about me. I am teaching in the MLIS program at Pitt. I am in a department that right now is called Information Culture and Data Stewardship in the School of Computing and Information. I think we might change that department name. So if you have suggestions, you know, we're open to that. Prior to my position at Pitt, I was the head of teaching and learning at Duquesne's Gumberg Library, and there I got a doctorate in instructional technology. And so for me, and perhaps for you, what I knew about design thinking came from instructional design and thinking about the instructional design process. But design thinking is very similar to that, but a little bit different. So some of you may be familiar with design thinking. Some of you, this may be something totally new, but for this session today, I did want to just define it so that we are all on the same page, and also talk about the critiques that are out there about design thinking, because I think that's important too. And then also provide some examples of how design thinking has been implemented in academic libraries. So look at some examples just in various academic libraries. And then also talk about the connection between design thinking and the MLIS. And there's a lot of sort of conversation about design and design thinking and how that can be integrated into the education for library science students. And that's something that we at Pitt have sort of tried experimenting with. So I'll talk to you about how that has gone and how perhaps hopefully you might also get involved with that. And like Kate said, if you have any questions, please feel free to chat or say something. So design thinking is a human-centered approach to problem solving that really encourages empathy, listening, and collaboration. So it's all about sort of designing for what people want. And this started, of course, not in libraries. This started in design firms and thinking about designing tools, spaces, those sort of things for what users actually want and need, rather than just what the designer thinks that people want. So IDEO might be a company that you've heard about before. If not, that's fine. But they are big on sort of coming up with toolkits, and one of these toolkits is actually for libraries. So they worked with, let me just check my notes so I remember who. So in 2018, they worked with Chicago Public Libraries and with Aarhus, I'm going to say that's how it's called, public libraries in Denmark. So this was a grant-funded, Bill and Melinda Gates grant-funded toolkit that you can visit by going to designthinkingforlibraries.com. A lot of the examples they have are from public libraries, but certainly it's strategies and tools and thinking that would certainly work for libraries. And then this is also something that came out in ACRL's Keeping Up with Design Thinking. They had a whole article about what design thinking is and the process, which we'll talk about, and some examples in academic libraries too. So that's another resource that if this is interesting to you, if this is something that you think might be relevant to the ways that you approach your spaces, your services, your tools that you provide users, that's a place that you can go. So let's talk about the design thinking process. And like I said, for those of you who are familiar with instructional design, this might be familiar to you, or for those of you who have been familiar with design thinking before. So again, this is all about trying to discover some sort of problem. In design thinking, they're usually looking at some sort of sticky problem that there's not an easy solution to. So how do you actually go about the problem solving steps to come to some sort of solution? So where they start from in the design thinking process is what they call empathy, which is essentially just learning about your users. And I think in academic libraries, this is something that we're always trying to do, is to try to better understand our users and also to try to center them in the work that we're doing. And so design thinking can be a mechanism of doing that, because through empathy, like empathetic interviewing, observations, focus groups, you learn about what your audience has issues with. You know, what's the problem that they're facing with spaces or services or other issues that come up in the library. And so once you get that information and feedback from your users, your patrons, students, faculty, whomever they are, you're able to gather that information and sort of focus on, well, what is the actual problem here? So we might have a sort of general sense of what is the problem, but once we do these interviews or focus groups or observations and gather that data, we can have a better sense of what exactly that problem is that our users are facing. And so that's the define stage, where you're actually saying, okay, this is the problem, this is the issue. And so then, you know, you might involve your users in sort of coming up with brainstorming. You might not. It depends on on the sort of problem that you're facing with. But usually you want to say, like, is this really the problem that you're facing? Are we describing it well? And then once they sort of sound off on that, you start to brainstorm to come up with creative solutions. And for those of you, there's an IDEO video out there where they have this like brainstorming session where they've come up with all sorts of ideas. Any idea can work. And so that's sort of what people do in design thinking is, you know, any idea can work for now in the brainstorming stage. So pretty much just how we think of brainstorming. So let's try to come up with solutions that maybe we haven't thought about before. And then at that point, you sort of start narrowing down on what sort of solution you think would be best and start creating prototypes. So prototypes are usually just simplified versions of what you think the solution would be. And that allows you to get feedback quickly on any sort of solution before really committing to maybe a high cost solution or something that's more complicated. So this is sort of an iterative process, ideally, where you're prototyping solutions, getting feedback from the users, which is the testing it out stage, and then perhaps redesigning it based on the feedback from users. So, you know, not something, this process I don't think is something that is too different than what a lot of us do when we're trying to approach problems, but is just sort of spelling out every step here and making sure that you're sort of hitting all these steps. But that sort of brings us to the critiques of design thinking. And the first one here, I think, is something that we really do need to consider. I think now especially is something we need to consider, and I will talk about how we might address this more in a minute. But the major critique here is that it doesn't remedy issues of power and bias. So it still privileges the designer over the people she serves. This article from Iskander essentially says, design thinking just upholds the status quo. It's not doing anything to make us question the systems in which we typically operate. It can help to perpetuate systems of oppression. So how can we better think about design thinking? And I have, well, not me, but there is an answer to that. Other people say that the issue is that it's a renamed research process. And while I understand that critique, I think what the reply from designers is that the research process is usually, when you're thinking about science, that is trying to determine what is sort of true or what is reality. And design thinking is really trying to create something. So create something into existence that doesn't already exist. The other issue is that it's kind of just a buzzword, and that's sort of related to the last point, is that organizations say they are using it but aren't. So they might not actually be walking through the design thinking process, but they say they're using design thinking because it sounds innovative. And the other issue that people have pointed out is that it's too linear. So it's not supposed to be so linear. I know that this structure sort of looks like you're just walking through each step, but as you can see the arrows, you are supposed to sort of revisit some of these steps as it's appropriate. But I think people can go about it too linearly, so that's another thing to keep in mind. But as far as the critique that it is focused too much on the status quo, that it doesn't do anything to help us address power imbalances, and that in fact it can keep the status quo of racism, white supremacy, hegemony. That is something that the people who have created equity by design framework have tried to address. And I think their design principles are really compelling. And so I've shared them all here because I think there's something for us to think about and maybe, think through as we are trying to think about how we might use the design thinking process in our academic libraries. So the design principle 1 that they have is design at the margins. And so they say designing at the margin means that those in privileged positions do not solve for those experiencing oppression. Rather, in true community, both the privileged and marginalized build collective responsibility and innovative solutions for our most intractable problems. So it's not about privileging the designer over the community or some sort of paternalistic approach. It's about involving the community and really putting those people who are traditionally marginalized into positions of doing the thinking, the designing in that work. And then their design principle 2 is start with yourself. So we must raise our awareness of our own identities and how bias impacts our thoughts, choices, conclusions, and assumptions to truly co-create with others. So they say that, sure, you can have this empathetic approach to trying to understand your users, but if you're still coming at it with your own biases, if you're still coming at it with your own sort of prejudices, then you might start to slot those responses from your users into stereotypical ways of thinking. So instead, you really need to be critical of yourself and think about, okay, am I coming at this with a bias, and is that coloring the way that I'm approaching the solutions? And I think that that's important for anything that we do, but especially in design thinking or any sort of designing where we're trying to keep our users in mind. And then design principle 3 is seed power. We believe that shared power is in the interest of everyone. So it's not just about the designer creating something, it's about involving your patrons, your students, your faculty, your staff, your alums into the process of creating something. And then design principle 4 is make the invisible visible. Pre-existing schemas can perpetuate exclusionary assumptions and biased practices. So this is sort of like design principle 2, except it's asking you to think about the actual structures, not just yourself, but what are the actual structures that maybe perpetuate oppression or marginalization of the people that you're trying to design for. And then design principle 5 is speak to the future. when we take control of our language, when we speak to the future, we lay the groundwork to create something new together. So what they say is that typically the language that we've used in the past represents these structures that are exclusionary and oppressive, and so we sort of need to speak into reality a new existence. So again, that is Equity by Design, created by Carolyn Hill, Michelle Molitor, and Christine Ortiz, who are all involved in their own sort of equity design spaces and equity labs, and so they've come together to come up with this. So let's think about how this might apply to academic libraries, how design thinking might apply to academic libraries. Academic libraries are typically risk averse. They're in institutions that are oftentimes risk averse, not always, but oftentimes, because the choices that are made, the decisions that are made impact a lot of people. And if something is messed up, that's impacting a lot of people. But what design thinking can allow is prototyping. So perhaps that's something a little bit safer. There's not as much financial issues involved. It also allows for some testing so that you're getting feedback, you're improving something, and also allows for small failures. So if there is a failure, it's not something that is going to stop everything. It's a small failure that you can manage. In that way, I think it can work really well in academic libraries. So let's look at some examples. This is an example from the University of Technology, Sydney. And they have an article in Weave that is all about how they better designed their signage. So not just their silent floor signage, they have lots of examples in the article that I suggest you check out. So the way that they approached design thinking is they did some observations, which seem, in the way that they describe them, a little bit creepy. They just seem to be spying on their students, but they also did have interviews with students and talked with students about the signage. So for the signage about noise level, these were all prototypes that they used that they found ultimately weren't successful. So people didn't understand them or didn't bother to read them. And so they decided to go with something that was both larger and simpler. And so you can see here, this is a silent floor, painted on the wall, very large, very visible. That's what they found to be sort of the most effective. And so they really were looking at how can they make their signage more understandable to students. For the most part, they were looking at students, directional, instructional, and also just some fun signs as well. And so they used the design thinking process to have some small failures and then ended up with what they feel like are pretty successful signs. The Oklahoma State University libraries did something similar to try to look at their research data management services. So they interviewed, I think, about 31 faculty across disciplines about their research data management process, as well as their students' research data management needs, and came up with, took all these interviews and used the design thinking process to really figure out what are the sort of major problems or issues or challenges in which the library can take a bigger role. And so realized that one issue was that the faculty didn't know about all the services that could be provided by the library. So they really focused on getting the message out, partnering with other folks around campus to make sure that people knew about the research data services at the library, as well as providing workshops about particular tools that could help those faculty who were involved in research data management. So their brainstorming for this and coming up with ideas was something that you see a lot in design thinking, of like using whiteboards or using those huge pads of paper and using sticky notes and coming up with as many ideas as possible, and then trying those out, getting feedback, and trying to come up with better and better ways of marketing the service and of providing actual services that are useful to the faculty. And then the last example that I want to share here is about transfer students. So at the University of Washington, one of their goals was to better involve transfer students in reaching out to transfer students and making sure the transfer students knew that they were there. And so what they did was they interviewed and had focus groups with both transfer students and university staff. And then the first thing that they brainstormed was essentially a panel of transfer students that would be held in the middle of a semester. And what they found was that transfer students didn't really come. No one really showed up for that panel. And so they got more feedback, you know, a small failure. It happens, right? We have workshops or sessions that maybe not a lot of people come to. So they got feedback from the transfer students just about, you know, time management, and that a lot of them are commuters. And so what they decided to do was to link up with orientation events, including undergraduate research, and just making sure that they were part of the orientation for transfer students. And this was much better attended. They also had a social with that they attended with the librarians. And so they found that this was a much more successful way of reaching transfer students. So, you know, had a hiccup in the middle, but were able to get enough feedback to do something different that reached more people. So just, I think, some considerations before I move to talking about design thinking and the MLIS. Might we find ways to engage students, faculty, and others that might be interested in what we do in the library as designers of solutions to space issues or to service issues themselves? So from that article that was sort of critiquing design thinking for maintaining the status quo, she writes, a design process where the designer is dethroned and where design is less a step-by-step march through a set of stages and more of a space where people can come together and interpret the ways that changing conditions challenge the meanings, patterns, and relationships that they had long taken for granted, I think could be something that we consider when we're trying to come up with solutions. And perhaps this is something your library has already done. And I'd be happy to hear about that as far as how you have involved students, faculty, alums, staff in trying to sort of come up with solutions to any challenges in the library. And then another consideration is just, and I'm not saying I necessarily have an answer for this, but just what sort of problems are really appropriate for this approach and which ones maybe are not. If we're thinking about design thinking allows for some rapid prototyping where we're trying things out and we're having small failures, might there be some sort of challenges or issues where that doesn't really work and we can't really address the problems through those ways? Probably true. So just to keep that in mind if you're thinking about adopting design thinking. So I wanted to now shift to thinking about design thinking in the Masters of Library and Information Science. So this is a conversation that has been going on for a couple years now for educators in LIS. And we are seeing some big names in this are Rachel Clarke and Stephen Bell. And Stephen Bell has written about design thinking mostly through an instructional design standpoint for libraries, because I think a lot of us are engaged in some sort of instruction or in creating educational objects, that sort of thing. So design thinking can help us through an instructional design lens come up with some solutions to maybe some instructional problems. But both Stephen Bell and Rachel Clarke argue that design thinking is really at the heart of librarianship, that so much of what we do, not just instructionally, but with our tools, our services, and our spaces, is about trying to solve problems in a human-centered way, so that we're really making our users, patrons, students, faculty, etc., the center of what we're doing. And so what they argue is that the MLS should be actually an MLD, so a Master's of Library Design. And what they propose in this article is that the curriculum would actually look quite different, in that like a design school, so that you would have some lectures, sure, about processes of design, and then the students would have hands-on studio time, is what they call it, where they're actually creating solutions to problems. And then there would be a day, like in design schools, dedicated to critiques, where the designs are presented and students and faculty give feedback on those designs. So this is their proposal. Rachel Clarke is at Syracuse and is an LIS educator, and I will say they haven't implemented this yet, but it's an interesting concept, and it's actually a concept that we, to a certain degree, ran with at Pitt when we were redesigning our curriculum, which I will tell you about. And so some of you are familiar with some of this redesign. We did in the sort of design thinking process of redesigning, we did get lots of feedback from alums. So for those of you who gave us feedback on this, we really appreciate that. And we continue to be interested in your feedback. So this is the way it looks. It's a design method sequence is what we call it. And it's a 3-term sequence that really focuses on experiential learning, because the students are working in design teams and collaborating with some sort of partner organizations. So through that 3-term sequence, they're going through the steps of design thinking. So empathizing, problematizing, or really defining what the problem is, ideating or just brainstorming, prototyping, and then evaluating the success of their prototypes. So we've got, right now, the students are in small teams, 3 to 5 people, and we really were not looking for, you know, all the students who are interested in academic libraries, you go here. All the students who are interested in school libraries, you go here. We wanted to have teams where there were folks with a variety of backgrounds, of experience with libraries, of interest, and of capabilities, to have it be a more dynamic team. And so within this, they collaborate with a partner organization. We've had lots of library partners. I think some of our partners are here right now, so thank you so much. Libraries, archives, museums, nonprofits, government organizations that we partner with, well, the student teams really partner with, to focus on solving a specific bounded scoped information problem. And so the way that we've usually talked about these problems is that they're just an issue that maybe you don't have time to focus on, but a student team that has a year can really focus on it and try to come up with a solution. So yeah, that's 3 terms, working with that partner organization, getting that hands-on experience that we hope is very valuable to both the students and the partners. So some example partners, we've worked, or the students have worked with the health sciences library system at Pitt, worked both on a process for creating digital displays of special collections and a process of coming up with more streamlined ways of developing instruction, especially online instruction, which of course has become even more important now, but that was already their project at the beginning of the academic year. And then also with ULS, Archives has a project where they will be, perhaps, I guess this is still a little up in the air, they'll be archiving emails from the university. So a process by which they might do that and might think about privacy issues, and then also thinking about how digital scholarship services can connect with faculty and liaison librarians to better promote all the wonderful tools they have and all the wonderful workshops they have. Another group is working with a group called Secret Pittsburgh, which is also Pitt-based. So these are so far a lot of Pitt-based units. And this is in the Department of English. The undergraduate students take a course called, not all of them, but some of them take a course where they're working on a guide about sort of Pittsburgh stuff you might not know about. And so this is really interesting and has lots of interesting partners involved, but not a lot of people know about it. So the students have been focused on how can they better promote this. And then they've also been working with the census, which has been very interesting. Essentially knowledge management, and also thinking about 10 years from now, when there is a census again, how can we transfer processes and knowledge to them in a way that is meaningful, so they are not tripping up on the same issues that this census group is. So those are not all the partners that we're working with, but just some examples. So let me talk about the first class. And these classes have long names that I can never remember, and nobody can. It's just sort of a running joke. So this is just DMS 1 is what we call it, really. And so in DMS 1, students observed their partners, they interviewed their partners, and then gathered information from these interviews and observations. So that's sort of the empathizing part, to try to determine what's the real issue here, what's the problem. So this is from Secret Pittsburgh's group. They let me use these photos of their what are called affinity walls, where they sort of break up all of the pieces of information that they've gathered and on those on white cards, and then they used other colored sticky notes to sort of group these together and start coming up with, okay, what's the issue here? And also maybe how might we start thinking about how we might solve this issue. So at the end of the course, they should have a pretty good understanding of what might the problem be and what might they start thinking about for the next term to solve that problem. And then in DMS 2, they really sort of solidify what it is that they're going to prototype, and they start prototyping and get feedback on their prototype from the partners, and then make changes, make a new prototype, and evaluate that again, so that they're always getting feedback from the stakeholders who are interested in this project. You can see in this slide, it has a Secret Pittsburgh social media post is what this would be, or essentially like an online flyer that says "Get lost and find yourself too," is one of the prototyped designs for social media marketing that this group came up with. And then in the last course, what ideally they'd be doing is evaluating the success of their project. So what we were hoping for, and I'll talk about why this didn't quite work out for this semester, or term, is to have the partners already have implemented solutions, and then the students would be able to evaluate the success of the solutions they came up with in the previous term. And then after that, the students come up with a transition plan because they're graduating. It's a one-year program. So a transition plan for the partner and maybe also for the next cohort of MLIS students. So that group maybe might be able to take on the problem if there's sort of a new problem that has arose, or it's not a problem that has been solved yet. But there were some issues, of course, as I think most of you are familiar with. You know, in March, we went totally online, and I think for a lot of the student partners, you know, processes were stopped. Some people were furloughed, unfortunately, and because of COVID-19, a lot of the partners had shifting priorities, and so the projects that the students were working on maybe didn't bubble up as important as some of the other sort of more pressing issues. So that was, of course, one issue. Another is simply the timing of the course, in that a lot of the partners didn't, even if there were no COVID-19, wouldn't necessarily be able to implement solutions, especially when we're working with academic partners, that when those academic partners are working with faculty and students are sometimes hard to get in contact with in the summer, and maybe instruction doesn't necessarily happen or outreach doesn't necessarily happen. So I think for us, we are really trying to rethink that third course and think about, do we need it? And think about if we still have it, what will it look like? I'm teaching it this semester, so basically the way that I modified it was the students did a sort of COVID-19 check-in for some of their partners, where they just sort of figured out, you know, how has this problem changed because of COVID-19, and then an evaluation plan. While they weren't able to, not all of them, some of them were able to sort of do an evaluation, but for those who didn't, they at least came up with an evaluation plan so that they're able to hand that off to the partner if the partner wants to evaluate the solution. And then they'll also have a transition plan that will be the final assignment, where they're really sort of handing this off and thinking about, does this project close? What needs to continue? What is necessary resource-wise for this to continue? So just some future directions that we'll be thinking about with the course. I think that it's really important for us to try to integrate some of that critical design thinking that Equity by Design has us think about. So, you know, really thinking about what is a critical approach that we can teach our students so that they have those strategies for when they're working with various communities. I mean, I don't think that, you know, at this point, we're working with very many stakeholders or traditionally marginalized communities, but if we get to that point, they need to be able to do that in a way that is really helping to dismantle structures of oppression rather than helping to maintain them. Another thing we've talked about, and that could happen, who knows, is that we are really thinking about offering these courses beyond the MLIS. So thinking about offering it to other students. Right now, we're housed in the School of Computing and Information. So perhaps information science students, computer science students, and having teams that are interdisciplinary so that students get that experience of working with folks who are not from their background or in their area of interest necessarily. And of course, we're looking for new partners as well, which is perhaps where you come in, because we are, of course, some of our partnerships will have to change dramatically because of who knows what the fall will look like. I wish I knew what the fall would look like, but I think none of us quite know what the fall will look like. And so if you are interested in collaborating, we're really looking for those sort of mutually beneficial partnerships so that students have that experience solving a problem, not most likely a mission critical problem is what we tell people, but solving a problem in an authentic situation, ideally remotely. So if you are interested in that, you can feel free to contact me. There is my email right there. We have a pretty healthy incoming class, I think, so we'll definitely be needing lots and lots of partners to do this, and needing to work with people who are flexible because of the way that we're unsure of, you know, will classes be face-to-face, will they be online, what will it look like? So if you've got something in mind, you can feel free to reach out to me and we'll talk about it. You know, usually it's a process of sort of talking through that possibility, because, you know, you and the students need to have shared expectations of what that's going to look like. So we just try to make sure that everyone's on the same page for what is required for that. So just to reiterate what I talked about here, design thinking, I think, can be a really good match for academic libraries in that it gives us a way to center our students and faculty and staff, alums, in trying to come up with solutions. And so because of this, design thinking can also be a good framework for our MLIS students, because once they go out there, you know, they'll be working in collaboratively. I'm sure all of you are working collaboratively to try to come up with solutions to issues that present themselves, to try to innovate, to try to best serve their users. So we really think that it's something that can help them, can cover a variety of sort of outcomes of, you know, collaboration, teamwork, and they really are thinking about how can they best manage group assignments, and then also meet the expectations of these partners that they're working with. But it's also important to keep in mind that design thinking has its limitations. I think the critiques against it are pretty solid. And so taking a more critical design thinking, a more equitable design thinking approach can help us to address some of these. So here are my references, and I'm happy to answer questions or to hear from you about maybe how you've used design thinking, or any response that you have to this framework or to the changes to the MLIS.
Thank you, Marcia. I just wanted to mention that I have been keeping an eye on the chat and we haven't had any questions yet, but please feel free to type your questions into the chat, or as Marcia mentioned, you could also unmute yourself and ask your questions that way as well.
Well, I will put in my email into the chat. Okay, I see the, are you looking to partner with individuals or instructors in classes in various departments that would benefit from this type of thinking? So we're looking to partner with, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be instructors. So we're looking to partner with librarians mostly, but anybody sort of in libraries, archives, museums, that sort of thing, who might benefit from having a team of students address a problem. And what usually we're looking for a sort of group of people that they can help, rather than just relying on sort of a one-to-one relationship, because, you know, they're trying to do observations and interviews and gather information about the problem. So usually having more than one person involved is best. So the, you know, for the census, it ended up becoming just one person because of personnel changes, but it started out with various committees and that they were able to work with in the census, and eventually whittled down to one, unfortunately. But yeah, ideally it would be sort of a group, a department, that sort of thing. Thanks for that question. Any other questions?
Marcia, you may have mentioned this. I'm just curious. Is this something all the students in the program take, or this is optional?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't specify. This is not optional. This is something that, this is a requirement of all the students. So all the students are in this sequence for the entirety of the year. We didn't have part-time students in it this year, or really the online students in this year, because we were doing it really just a face-to-face program, but now obviously we are expanding it to include online students, and they may all be online, I don't know. So yeah, that it's it is a requirement.
Thanks, that's interesting. Yeah. It's a neat series.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly, as I mentioned, some challenges and hiccups and things that we need to rethink, but I think it's been overall a positive experience. Overall, the partners seem pleased. You know, that it didn't always work out perfectly with everyone, but I think overall the partners are also appreciate the opportunity to sort of do some mentoring, because that's an important part of this, is that the partners, you know, they are in the libraries and in the archives and in the museums and in the government organizations. So they know what day-to-day looks like. And professors don't always realize that. So it's really important to have the connection with practitioners, I think, and have students be guided by practitioners.
Are there any other questions?
Well, thank you everyone so much for attending, and please feel free to reach out if you have an idea or feedback or anything like that that you don't feel comfortable sharing right now, or if you want to be perhaps one of our partner organizations, that would be great.
All right. Thank you everyone for attending our presentation today. As mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll get that posted to our YouTube channel soon. And then watch for an email with the evaluations for both of today's presentations, as well as recording information. And hopefully we'll see you next Friday, July 17th at 10 a.m. for our next set of presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.